Hi kids, today what we're going to do is we are going to talk about dependent and independent variables. These can be confusing, especially when you're asked to identify independent variables and dependent variables based on a situation. So what we're going to do, is I'd like to start out by giving you some extras that the book doesn't give you, And sometimes these extras just help a little bit when we are trying to figure all this stuff out, Because the book does a nice job of covering things, but it doesn't always cover everything the best that it can because it simply doesn't have room. So the first thing I want to point out is that independent variables are also called the manipulated variable, Another thing that the book might not tell you is that the independent variable can stand alone by itself. So it would make sense that it would just be there and be able to stand alone, Third thing about the independent variable is that the independent variable is the variable you are going to be changing, So there's some extras about independent variables, And think of the word independent. What do you think of when you think of the word independent? All right, so now let's talk about dependent variables, Dependent variables are also called responding variables. They are responding to something, The dependent variable depends on the other variable, The dependent variable will depend upon the other variable, Dependent means what, And then the other thing that I'd like to tell you is that you measure the dependent variable, The dependent variable is the thing that you will measure, So like temperature, or height of a tree growing, So those are dependent variables, right? The other thing that I would like to also talk to you about is show you a couple of examples when we're talking about independent and dependent variables. Now, when identifying the independent variable and dependent variables, think of it as what depends on what, In other words, it always helps to write down a blank and set up this question. So in other words, if you're trying to figure out what the independent and dependent variables are, it helps if you write down a blank sentence or statement that I'm about to show you, And here it is. What depends on what, And this what will be the dependent variable. This one will always be the dependent variable when you ask this question, and the other one will be the independent variable. So what you have is the dependent variable depends on the independent variable. So if you can think in terms of this sentence, what depends on what, and you remember that the first what is the variable and the second what is the independent variable, you might be a little bit better at identifying the two of them. Let me show you an example of this right now, If the situation involves time, if the situation involves time, hours, days, months, or minutes, the measure of time will usually be the independent variable, but not always, But not always. Now, here's an example. There is a relationship between the number of hours that Sarah works at SeaWorld in July and the amount of money she will earn on her paycheck in July, So if we ask ourselves what depends on what, we can see that her money, what she gets in her paycheck, depends on the hours that she works. And that kind of makes sense, doesn't it? If you want to make more money, you have to work more hours. So your money is dependent upon the hours you work. So the same with Sarah. Okay, so there's an example of identifying the dependent variable, which is money, and the independent variable, which is hours worked. Alrighty. Now the book then goes on to give you an example, and it says, what does it mean for one quantity? What does it mean for one quantity to depend on another quantity? And they give you a situation where they're talking about an orchard. An orchard sells apples by the pound. Each day, the number of pounds P of apples sold and the amount of money M taken in is recorded. Which variable, P or M, depends on the other variable? Okay, so the situation is this. You have an orchard that sells apples by the pound. Each day, the number of pounds of apples sold and the amount of money taken in is recorded. And so which variable, P or M, depends on the other one? So right now in your head, you're probably thinking this through, and you're probably saying to yourself, okay, the dependent variable changes in response to the other variable. For the apple orchard, the amount of money taken in will depend on the number of pounds of apples sold. The more pounds sold, the more money taken in. And you can call the amount of money M, the variable M, taken in, the dependent variable. So the dependent variable in this situation, the dependent variable in this situation is the amount of money taken in. Okay, it is dependent upon the apples being sold. Okay, the independent variable causes the dependent variable to change. So the number of apples P sold is the independent variable. Okay, the number of pounds P affects the amount of money M taken in. All right, so some other examples would be the following examples. Okay, the dependent variable, if you want to think about how much money you're going to make, it might depend on how much junk you sell at a garage sale. Okay, another way of thinking of it is if you want to get more money by working, you have to work more hours at an hourly rate. Sometimes we think in terms of vacation. And if your vacation is dependent on your money, it would then mean that your vacation is a dependent variable and saving your money becomes the independent variable. All right? So your vacation is dependent upon the independent variable of how much money you can save. All right? Now, remember, what you want to ask is this: what depends on what? Okay? And sometimes even when you ask that, it can be a little bit confusing. Okay? Now, in many situations, notice that we can often think in terms of the dependent variable and what will happen as a result of it. So a lot of times we can think in terms of this dependent variable and what we need to do independently to get that dependent variable to do what we want it to do. So in other words, if we think of the dependent variable and getting more money, we say, well, that's dependent on how many hours we work. And I can independently influence the number of hours. So the number of hours I work can change, which means the money that is dependent on that can change with it. Okay? So anyways, the next thing I want to do is show you a couple of examples in here. Now, these are right out of your book. So I'm going to go over them with you and give you a little hint. You can pause the video and see if you can answer them, and then start the video and I'll explain the answer. Okay? So let's look at number 1. Okay? The height of a plant, the height, H, of a plant and the amount of water it receives. Pause the video and see if you can identify the dependent and independent variable. Okay, here we go. The independent variable is the water. The dependent variable is the height. In other words, the height of the plant is the dependent variable, and the height of the plant depends on the amount of water it gets, which is the independent variable. Okay? Question number 2. Let's do number 2. The amount of hours H worked and the amount of money M earned. Which is the independent variable and which is the dependent variable? Pause the video and see if you can figure it out. Okay, here we go. Well, the answer to this one is as follows. The independent variable is H, the number of hours, okay, worked. And the dependent variable is M, the amount of money earned. So in other words, the dependent variable is the money, and it depends on how many hours you work, which is the independent variable. Okay? All right, let's try number 3. The number of shelves in a bookcase and the number of books the bookcase can hold. Okay, pause the video and see if you can figure out this one. It can be tricky. All right, here we go. All right, the answer is this according to the mathematicians. The independent variable is S, the number of shelves in a bookcase, and the number of books, B, is the dependent variable. So in other words, what they're saying is the dependent variable books, okay, how many books you can have depends on the number of shelves you have, okay? So you can kind of manipulate those to think about them differently, but the mathematicians are viewing it as the books are the dependent variable, and they depend on the number of shelves, okay? So the number of shelves in a bookcase and the number of books in the bookcase can hold, okay? All right, so anyways, let's try a couple other examples, okay? Writing to explain. Jake and Viola keep track of the number of miles, M, they bike to help find out the number of calories, C, that they burn. Viola says the number of calories, C, that they burn is the dependent variable. Do you agree? Pause the video and think that over and come up with an answer. Alrighty, let's see what the answer actually is. Well, the answer is yes. The number of calories they burn depends on how many miles they bike. Notice how they keep track of the miles to determine the calories they burn, okay, which is kind of a neat thing because they're keeping track of the miles and then they determine how many calories they will burn. So they could actually create a table to compare those changes, okay? Now, going on, let's talk about that biking question a little bit more. In the biking problem in exercise 4, the last question, could there be other independent variables that affect the dependent variable? Explain at least one more independent variable. So in other words, could other things influence how many calories are burned? Pause the video and see if you can come up with that answer. Well, here we go, kids. The answer is yes. The speed at which they bike could also be an independent variable because it can affect the number of calories they burn too. So not just the time they spend riding, but the speed at which they ride could influence how many calories. All right? So think of it this way. The faster they go, the speed will cause them to burn more calories. The harder they push themselves, okay? They will burn more calories. Well, anyways, I'm going to stop the video now, and if you're in school, you're probably going to do a Kahoot or a Nearpod activity to kind of review this and discuss it more. If you're at home, you can just go on into the next activity. Have a good day, kids.